Ladies and gentlemen, in this Gaming Telecom video, I'm going to be discussing I Am Setsuna, which is a Japanese RPG modelling itself after the likes of the Final Fantasies and the Chrono Crossers. It is developed by Tokyo RPG Factory and published by Square Enix, and is currently on both the PlayStation 4 and the PC. Throughout this video there will be minor spoilers, however I'm going to avoid major plot points and that type of thing. Instead it may be the odd character you meet along the way, for example members of your party, weapons, and possibly various magic will be slightly spoiled, that type of thing, but it's not anything that's going to destroy the experience for you should you decide to purchase the game and play it in the future. So, with all that said, with the disclaimery stuff out of the way, how am I finding it? Well, I'm about 3/4 of the way through right now, and regular viewers of the podcast will know that I've been pretty much engrossed with this title, and really enjoying it so far. I'm going to talk slightly about the plot. This is not a spoiler because it even mentions this on the Steam store page. So essentially, you are in a party with Setsuna, who is a young lady, and you are basically on a pilgrimage to offer a sacrifice, which in this case is her. The purpose of the sacrifice is pretty simplistic. Basically, monsters decide to ruffle stomp the land, and if the sacrifice doesn't go ahead, they're just going to run rampant. So a sacrifice is offered, and for whatever reason, which I'll remain silent on, they decide to, stop their advances, and life can continue fairly peacefully. As you can imagine, however, it doesn't really go so smoothly as your adventure continues, and that's what this story is about, as well as the characters you meet. And obviously you've got the various side quests, you've got the various plot points and the tear-jerking moments that you can expect in a traditional Japanese-style RPG, and for the most part it does a pretty damn good job. There isn't any major cringeworthy dialogue, and for the most part the dialogue is well written, it's short to the point, and you don't feel that the story is just waffling on, which is always a nice touch. There is no voice acting, however, so you're going to have to do a lot of reading. There is the odd bit of voice acting when it comes to combat that is strictly Japanese, however it would just be 1 or 2 lines of dialogue here or there. For example, if you get smacked by an enemy, your character might, give them a taunt or something. As one can imagine, as you're progressing through the world, as you're travelling to different destinations, you're going to get to go to various towns and cities where you can do the traditional things such as buy weapons and upgrades and buy, of course, Sprite. Now, the purchase system works very differently to most games. If you've played something like, say, Final Fantasy, you know that as you defeat a monster, you'll get given a gil, which is cash, and also the odd drop here or there, which is, maybe something good. It may just be something along the lines of piece of junk, which you can then sell. In I Am Setsuna, that isn't the case, and you're going to regularly notice powders and scarves and cloth and various other bits and pieces drop consistently. Now you may think at the very start, especially if you've not been paying much attention to the dialogue and you've just been trying to skip your way into the game and get into the combat, what the hell is this about? Well, basically you sell this stuff to the Sprite vendors. I'll get into what that is in just a second, and that is what you will then be able to purchase stuff. For example, if a piece of Sprite requires a piece of ivy and a scarf to purchase, as long as you've got those, you've sold to the vendor, then you can buy that piece of Sprite, providing that you've still got those in the kitty. So in short, if you buy the piece of Sprite, you've used the materials to purchase that item. So what is Sprite? Well, in its simplest form, you can think of it very much like materia from Final Fantasy VII. I guess that's the simplistic way of putting it. It unlocks a couple of different abilities. You've got everything from command, which would be attack or, say, cure type of spells. For example, it might allow you to cast fire, or it might allow you to cast some healing spell. You've also got support-based Sprite, which allow you to create barriers and shields. And finally, you've also got the likes of Spriner, which allow you to recuperate magic if you've killed an enemy and so on. It works rather well and allows you to create rather powerful party setups. Now, what you're going to notice is that you can also equip various talismans to your characters. Now, there are a couple of different things that these do. One is a bonus effect, which is essentially passive, and the second is a flux bonus, which is probably the more important out of them. So as your ATB gauge goes up, which is very much like any Japanese RPG that you might have played, if it reaches the maximum, you're going to notice a little blue, well, ball in the corner, which eventually also rises up as well, and eventually you'll get a star up to a maximum of 3. If you activate an attack, for example, let's say fire, and at the right time you press square or the equivalent button on your controller, you're going to activate a bonus attack with that ability. If then you get very, very lucky indeed, you'll get a flux bonus, which is then the ability of the talisman automatically associated with that spell, and you can have up to 10 of them, which allows you to create very powerful characters indeed, which does also lead to a lot of grinding should you wish to really maximize your characters. For the most part, I really like how combat continues throughout the game, and you're probably going to find a party which works really well for you, because you can start having combinations of attack. For example, 2 characters can have almost like a synergy, and they can have a very devastating attack which works together to do massive amounts of damage to either one enemy or all of the enemies on screen, but obviously you're using both characters' ATB gauges to do that. For the most part, I really like combat, but there are a couple of small issues I have with it. The biggest problem I have is there are a lot of monsters which can be rather frustrating to fight against, which you're just kind of going throughout your story. For example, there are an awful lot of enemies which have status effects. There are an awful lot of enemies which have very high evasion, which means essentially you're just waiting for a turn for them to get out of their evasion state so that you can finally hit them. And also there are several enemies which will blow themselves up after you have killed them. Now, what that means is obviously you're going to take a massive amount of damage, and if you're facing large swarms of those enemies, it can be rather frustrating to have essentially the potential to have your entire party wiped out. I've also noticed that the game's difficulty, particularly in the latter half, definitely goes up massively. There's a rather not so subtle difficulty curve increase, so if you haven't been paying much attention and you've just been hammering the A button on a lot of bosses, which you can certainly get away with in most cases, towards the latter half of the game, you're probably going to notice that you'll wipe a lot more, and it may be that you're under-leveled as well. And I wish the game did a better job of balancing itself out. There are a couple of other smaller issues, particularly with the flux system. Although the game doesn't specifically require its usage, it also does a pretty poor job of explaining itself and a few other elements which are pretty key in my opinion. So I do wish that tutorials in the game were a little better, but overall I find the combat system rather enjoyable. So let's talk about the next logical point of the game, the towns themselves, the weapons and other such things. So just to touch on the weapons, generally speaking, you can find weapons after certain main events of the game has progressed. The vendors will carry new weapons that obviously will be buyable for your characters. Now, as you sell the items I mentioned earlier to the vendor, you also get cash, which you can then use that money to buy, let's say, new weapons or potions or whatever you need to help you throughout the journey. Now, weapons can also be upgraded. There are a couple of different levels. At the start of the game, you're going to get what is known as mithril, and that can upgrade the stats beyond the traditional damage. So, for example, let's say it did 28 points of damage standard. If you use a piece of mithril to enforce it, it may do 31, 32 points of damage. So it's up to you if you've got the spare cash, or if you're prepared to grind your way to get that cash to enforce your weapons or not. It's certainly possible to go throughout the game without doing that, But if you do opt to do it, then you're going to notice that your magic attacks do more, your physical damage does more, and you also have more defense against certain attacks as well. Being a little petty for a moment, one small issue I have with the title is that there is no inn at all in the game, as far as I've seen. So, if you want to fully rest your characters, the only option is to use a tent. I'm not quite sure what the decision-making process was to do that. It's one of the only Japanese RPGs I think I've ever played where there is no inn facility. It's not a big deal because fortunately tents are quite cheap. I believe they're like 200 gold, so they are costing nothing. But it's more of the strangeness of having to go back to the world map to be able to utilize a tent so that you can do that. And of course you can use the tents at save points as well. Well, it is an RPG, so I suppose the most logical thing for us to focus on would be the story. Now, I know spoilers are definitely a thing, so I don't want to give away anything spoiler-ish or spoiler-related. However, there are a couple of issues I have with the story, and it's not necessarily in the way it's told, it's more that sometimes it feels very padded out. Now, I don't want to give specific locations, and I also don't want to show them on screen, simply because some of them happen at major plot points, and it would be very unfair for me to spoil that for you. So you're going to have to unfortunately take my word for it, which I know sucks, but it is what it is. But in a couple of locations, you are sent to a location, or you go to a location, and then you find that you have to battle your way through a series of monsters. Then you get to the location you were told to get to, and then you're set, and then something along the lines of, nope, the princess is in the other castle. Now, I wouldn't mind that so much. Unfortunately, most of the time it sends you back to where you've just been. For example, you might go to Cave A and then get sent back to Town B, which you just was at like 20 minutes ago, for something to happen, and then you get sent back right where you were again. And this actually happens several times throughout the story. Now, I'm not hating on it, but it does feel very much like they did it to artificially lengthen the game a little. And you'll also notice, especially in various towns, there is certainly the air of the old clone brush, particularly with some of the characters, which isn't a big deal. You're also going to notice that throughout combat as well. There is an awful lot of enemies which simply are the same, but they simply have their sprite colours change, or rather their colouring change. So for example, that might be brown in one and a darker brown in another kind of thing, which isn't a big deal. I feel that some of this is down to budget constraints, so I'm not hating on it, because ultimately, for the most part, it hasn't affected my enjoyment of the game. And that, my friends, is really the crux of the matter. I am enjoying the game. It does have faults. It's not perfect. So, if you're expecting it to be the new Chrono Cross, the new Final Fantasy VII, you're possibly going to be a little disappointed. But if you go into it thinking to yourself, this is going to be a good game where I can just settle down and just enjoy it, enjoy the story, and accept that there will be some quirks, there will be some oddities of design. I know I'm probably going to get the odd question in the comments if I don't address this in the video regarding the snowy locations. So yes, the game, at least as far as I've gotten, apart from some internal areas, which would be obviously the caves or the temples and that type of thing, and I don't want to show those too much because that's generally where plot points happen. Typically the game in the external locations is all set in ice and snow, which can look a little repetitive, but then again, a lot of games also do the massive grass fields, so I don't particularly mind it. I find it quite different as an aesthetic, and I really like the little touches, for example, being able to see your footprints in the snow and all that jazz. So yeah, my opinions on I Am Setsuna. If you're not interested in Japanese RPGs, this is probably not going to sway you by any stretch of the imagination. On the other hand, if you are into Japanese RPGs and you've got either a PC or PlayStation 4 and you're looking for something to play here and now, yeah, I can totally see it. It's not the world's lengthiest game. I don't know exactly the hours I've clocked up. This is including some grinding and certainly doing a lot of AFKing, but I'm probably going to go with maybe the 20 to 30 hour mark, depending. But you probably, if you're trying to get everything, if you're trying to get a lot of the fluxes, you could maybe stretch the game to about 30 to 40 hours. I'm purely guessing here, to be honest with you. But it's lengthy enough where you're not going to feel cheated, coughing up the cash. So yeah, my opinion, if you're liking what you've seen, go ahead and check the game out. I do feel the developers need a little support with this title. It's not perfect. It does have some... I kind of wish they hadn't have done that. Parts of the game, for example, as I mentioned, I wish that there was an inn. I wish that a lot of the enemies didn't have so many bloody status effects. That's extremely annoying when they blow up after you've defeated them. That can be kind of annoying. It wouldn't be so bad, but there is an awful lot of enemies, especially the midpoint onwards, that do that. And although I haven't died to it at all, I have lost a character and then you have to revive them, which is kind of a pain in the butt. And as I mentioned, the biggest qualm I have in terms of the combat is I feel the difficulty just goes up a little too fast, too steeply. Especially with Spry Knight monsters. I don't want to give away too much with them, but basically if you see a monster that's out of the norm for that area and it's generally alone, so for example, if all the monsters in the area are, let's just say for the sake of argument, with brown markings, and you see one with black markings, you're probably, unless you're very well rested and just saved, you're probably going to want to stay away from it, because there's a very good possibility it's going to kick your ass. And I don't just mean it's tough as in a little tough, it can be actually harder than a lot of the bosses in that area. Oh, and there is one final point that I want to make about the game. If you happen to come across any locked chests, and all the text you get on screen that says it's locked, don't frustrate yourself trying to open it or switch to different characters thinking one of them has a lock-picking skill or any of that. There's a specific plot point that very late in the game that you get an item to unlock those chests, which I have a slight issue against. I feel that the game should have explained that you have nothing to unlock those, rather than, you know, trying different characters on it, because I've actually seen quite a few people struggle with the locked chests. And the second issue is that because they are dotted throughout the game, it can also lead to you having to do an awful lot of backtracking if you want to collect those items. So if you're a completionist, that may irritate you a little bit, but I wanted to mention that in this video just in case, let's say, you decide to buy the game and then are screaming in rage against the screen because you can't figure out why the hell a certain chest is not unlocking and you think you have to press a switch or something in the dungeon. With all of that said, would I purchase the game? Well, I did. So, don't regret my purchase. Just to clarify, this is not a review copy and this is not sponsors or anything. So yeah, this is my own opinion and all of that jazz. But, with all of that said, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I'll see you soon. Take care of yourselves, guys. Bye for now.